Welcome back to the SelfActualize Podcast, where we bring you insights from top performers, expert coaches, and founders building at the edge. I'm your host, Anmol, and today we're picking up where we left off with Brian Lee. So Brian is the co-founder and CEO of Revenue Vessel, a company redefining how logistics sales teams find and win deals. So if you missed part one, we went deep on Brian's journey from data-driven operator to founder and how we built a 0 to 1 outbound motion with nothing but grit, spreadsheets, right, and cold emails. But today we're bringing in a new perspective, right? One that's been critical to Brian's success behind the scenes. His sales coach, Morgan Shelly. So Morgan is a senior account executive at Deel, former sales leader at Flexport, and she's a sales coach who's helped both reps and founders up level their game. She's crushed quota, she's built onboarding programs, and she's coached some of the top performing SDRs, AEs, and founders out there. And now she's helping Brian make the lead from founder-led hustle to kind of repeatable, scalable sales. Morgan, welcome to the show. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much
Can,
for having me. An honor.
yeah, can I hop into and just say something real quick about Morgan?
Absolutely.
I thought that was a great intro on Morgan. What I would say is that when I worked at Flexport with Morgan, she was the top performing rep. And also, like, what I found was that I was always going to Morgan first with any feedback or advice on process and process improvements. Morgan was always the most willing to do it. And I think that the reason why I wanted to bring her on as a sales coach when I eventually started Revenue Vessel was because the way that she thought about process was the most thorough. And that gave me incredible confidence that she could also teach process as well.
Right.
And she's done that really vigorously with us. So that's another thing that I wanted to add on to your intro to Morgan, that I wanted to emphasize myself.
Amazing. Okay.
Really nice words, Brian. Yeah, thanks so much.
And Brian, welcome back to the podcast. Good to see you again, too.
Yeah, of course. Good to see you
Excited
too.
about part two. Yeah. All right. So Morgan, why don't we start with you? Okay. So we went through a little bit of your intro. Brian added some color, but let's hear from you. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your journey? You've got a pretty diverse background, from teaching to boxing to obviously sales and coaching and sales leadership, both on the SDR side of the house, AEs, founders. So tell us a little bit about your path.
Loaded question. Again, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. I'm a former teacher, and similar to what Brian mentioned, I think my ability to teach founders or coach team members or sell effectively to clients is due to my background in education. It plays a huge part in every role that I've had in my sales career. Also a former boxing instructor and a lover of boxing. I still box regularly, an avid boxer. And then transition into my first ever SDR role at Flexport, and had the honor and privilege of working with Brian Lee. He's truly brilliant. And so when I learned he was starting a startup, I was just, first of all, interested, and then offered, hey, if you ever need help with anything, don't hesitate to reach out. And fast forward a few sales roles, and I'm currently a senior account executive at Deel, but I do some sales consulting on the side for sales teams, sales leaders, sales founders, or founders that are looking to break into sales. I also do career coaching for, entry-level roles, trying to break into tech sales, all the way up to executives that are having difficulty finding their ideal role. So kind of a little bit of everything, but it's what I enjoy doing, and I've absolutely loved being able to consult and coach Brian and the Revenue Vessel team.
Love that. Well, you've definitely had a unique path. So Morgan, we're definitely going to come back to you more in depth in just a second. Before you do, Brian, let me kick it over to you. And you mentioned a little bit about this, Brian, already, but how did your relationship with Morgan start? Right? What made you seek out a coach? at that specific point in your journey? Kind of talk to us a little bit about that. You talked about the process part of it already, but go deeper if you can.
Yeah, well, I think at first it wasn't about sales coaching at all. Like I knew that Morgan was doing sales coaching. Like I had followed her on LinkedIn. It had been a while since we had last chatted. But the reason why I reached back out to her was because just given the thoroughness of Morgan's approach and in how she approached Flexport sales, her perspective was one that I wanted to really use in like developing materials on teaching our own customers, right? Which are doing something similar, and how you go and ramp up sales on their end. And that's why we re-engaged and we talked again, because I was super interested in hearing like, okay, now, especially as we're starting to build out this product, we wanted a lot of Morgan's perspectives there. And the way it transitioned into a sales coaching was ultimately it turned into ultimately what it turned into is it turned out that we were actually losing deals early on, and there wasn't like a good reason that we should have lost those deals in my view, right? Like I think that it was really hard to communicate the value. It was really hard to just get people excited about, yes, we will give you money to do this thing. And even though we had some early wins, we felt that momentum had stalled. Now, that was for a variety of reasons, but the first of which we thought was, how do we up our sales? And eventually I just said, hey, Morgan, I would love for you to teach me how to sell. And I sent her a couple of recordings. She had some really great feedback. And from there, that's where our relationship really started. And now we meet weekly. We talk all the time on just different strategies. And it feels like Morgan is super involved with our team and understands everything that's going on.
So it was specifically on sales coaching, like how you performed on the call. You'd send her the
Yeah,
transcripts, and
that's right.
so Morgan, talk to me a little bit about that. So Brian, we know he's already brilliant, but he sent you the call transcript, and then what happened from there? Walk me through kind of like what you saw in the transcript that started the coaching process.
You can be honest too, Morgan.
I need to pull up. I'm just like Brian said, I'm incredibly thorough. So I have notes dating back for all of the call recordings that he shared with me and all of the feedback notes that I've given him. Again, really rooted in best practices and educational theory and immediate like enforcement in terms of feedback given. And so like Brian finds it most helpful when I actually pinpoint a specific timestamp. I acknowledge maybe the challenge or the difficulty, and then we role play or discuss maybe how that could have gone differently. I am a holistic person that I have to see the big picture in order to identify smaller details or changes. So I typically listen to the entire call, I take notes, and then go back in and we highlight key themes or areas to focus on to grow. Luckily, like I said, Brian is brilliant. So after I provide that immediate feedback, typically within a day or two, he's turning around saying, wow, I implemented that feedback and we're seeing a night and day difference. So it has been really cool to see the momentum and success that's been able to accumulate week over week.
And then what were those specific things that you were helping them on those first calls? Was it ejection handling, discovery? Like what were the things that you helped them?
Yeah, great question. Initially, it was a lot about call structure, and because Brian is a founder, he's not a born salesman. It's owning the energy, the confidence to lead a sales process and be confident with executives or a buying committee of like executives that he was selling to. So we focused primarily at first on call structure, a firm proposed agenda at the beginning of every call was incredibly important. Then going into discovery, honing in, especially on a new product, honing in on what discovery questions are most important or crucial to get answered in order to deliver a customized platform demo. Effective demoing techniques. And then lastly, the absolute importance of positioning pricing effectively and scheduling and securing next steps. From there, it's evolved into smaller tweaks of how to say things better, how to communicate more concisely when communicating the value, connecting the dots for prospects when they are in the buying process.
Yeah. I also want to add that there have been a couple different phases of our journey together as well, where the first phase started at like just very basic, here's how you run a disco one-on-one that Morgan's talking about. Eventually, like it got to the point that we were comfortable with that, and we still felt like customers and prospects weren't really seeing the value of what we were doing in a clear way, where we felt like there was a lot of value that we did have. And then it became, how do you actually make materials that visually show and demonstrate all these things to help people connect the dots? Because at the end of the
The
day,
slide deck, yeah.
that's right. And at the end of the day, the key is if someone sees what you're doing and understands how to articulate that in their own value, they'll be interested in having the next couple of conversations. So really, so then like it was really, how do we create the collateral that lands with our customers? And then there was another period where like we had the materials, but then sort of I lost the basics a little bit. And there were calls where I felt like things went off the chain. And I was like, what's going on? Because theoretically, all the pain aligns with the value that we offer. And there was another period where Morgan was like, dude, go back to basics. Like, here's what we do, right? And so I would in our life cycle now, I would say that those are the three key milestones and three key eras of our partnership.
Talk to me a little bit about that as far as you're on a call. Let's say it's that first call with a prospect. So are you using a slide deck to discuss the benefits and articulate the high level of your platform, and then you go into the live demo? So you think that having that collateral in that slide deck is key?
Yeah,
I do.
totally.
I
Um,
pushed it. Yeah, I pushed it hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, just when you look at the anatomy of how like Morgan and I have talked about this, and now this is the way that we run it, and now I'm a drill sergeant for our newest reps to do this too. But in essence, it starts with just understanding true pain, and I find myself coaching a lot today on here is like a subtle tell on pain and what this
Mhm.
means is underlying it, right? And you just have the only way you train that is with experience and then with our own collateral, which again, Morgan has encouraged me to write a lot on what exactly each tell means and what does that mean holistically to then guide the set of questions you're going to ask and guide the story you want to tell, right? Because we pitch to marketers, for example, and they're going to want something slightly different and they're going to want the value communicated to them in a different way than a sales leader, which is also different than a sales rep who's looking to just expand a new business geographically. So the first is, how do you run just a tight discovery to understand their persona, how they see the world, and what their challenges are? And really what I found the deck is really good at is sort of putting into context their challenge and explaining the why this is happening to them. So really like we have in graphic detail, like, okay, you said that your pain is that you can't run these campaigns. Here's how we understand the pain. Like help me understand if this is like the true cause and the root symptoms of why you're feeling this way. And then we'll go into that story, right? And then they'll go, oh yeah, totally. And then from there, now you can start to explain, okay, this is why revenue vessel exists. And it's through that vessel that you can really start to understand and communicate the value prop of what we're doing. And then by that point, then what we've talked a lot about is, okay, how do you once you set up that base, how do you tell a discovery? How do you do a demo that touches on that story really well and resonates value off the bat? And that entire stack on our disco call, this is the process that we've germinated that we've
Mhm.
cultivated over time and incubated. And that is like if we do this right, we know that a deal cycle will move fast. We know that eventually like they'll be really excited. They'll be very happy to refer us to leadership. And all of these things will be true.
So
So
the reason why
proud.
yeah, yay. So the reason why I asked that question, so for years when I've sold and when I was a rep or when I was a leader, I had the PowerPoint, right? And I was at big companies like Dell and EMC and Palo Alto Networks, and we had our PowerPoint deck for marketing. And then we had a very clear kind of pitch around the PowerPoint deck, but it all kind of revolved around that. What I've done over the last couple of years, I've almost found myself getting away from that. So like I'll start now what I do is I start the call, and obviously there's the rapport building and getting to know the person at the beginning. Then there's the discovery that's very tight and concise. And then I actually launch into the story and the value prop of the offering and what we're trying to achieve that aligns to the pain. But I don't use PowerPoint. That's more of a conversation. And then I move into the demo and I share my screen and I run through the demo. And I guess there's two schools of thought. One school of thought is if you're not using the PowerPoint and it's more of a conversation, then it's more, I could potentially use the PowerPoint as a crutch, where maybe I come across more credible if I don't have that PowerPoint in front of me. And it's easier to kind of bob and weave if I don't have the PowerPoint. If I do have it in front of me, then I have to, if there's a pain point on the slide that doesn't align with what they said, I can't, like, I'm not able to update the PowerPoint in real time. But so I can see how there's like a give and take, or there's positives and negatives of both points. So it's the reason why I asked that question.
I'll say personally, based on the coaching that I've provided Brian in my own personal experience, I'm a visual learner. I learn better with the visual representation. The slides should be short, concise, and what we've seen, at least from the feedback I've gotten from Brian and listening to the feedback from prospects on calls, there was a aha light bulb moment when the slides were introduced. Something about it paints the picture visually rather than just the narrative. I totally agree with you. Should not be reliant on a slide deck. You should not be stuck in a 45, at this A, B,
slides,
C.
yeah.
Yeah. If it's relevant, great. If not, get rid of it. But I do think based on the pain points and ICP that Brian sells to, the slides are always relevant. And picking and choosing which slides are most relevant to share to elicit that light bulb moment, I think is a learned skill that we've discussed. But totally, yeah, I hear you. I know a lot of people that are anti slide deck, and I think that Brian can also agree that I've seen positive results from implementing some visuals.
I think that there was also a period where there was a time where there's a couple of different ways to use slides, right? And it matters how you present it. And I think that now I'm much more cognizant of how do you use slides to tell a story that resonates versus how do you talk through slides. And there was a period, and maybe Morgan, you want to even talk about this, but like there was a period where I did feel like I was actually just going through the slides and it was just emotion.
Yeah.
And maybe you could talk about that and like what your feedback to me was in that moment.
Great example, Brian. So on the second call, I recommend that Brian and the team create a like what we learned slide. Basically, it's a recap of the challenges that the key stakeholders mentioned on the first call, and make sure that everyone is aligned on where the second call is going to go and where the evaluation is kind of structured. It also, I think, just professionally shows a level of preparedness for that call that just bodes well with stakeholders. But originally, Brian was reading those slides. He was taking the recommendation. I said identify 3 of the main pain points or challenges that the prospect is experiencing, and identify those, and then say how your product can alleviate those challenges for the prospect. And he would pull up the slides and read through them, and it was missing the pop or this wow factor. So we reconfigured the slides very minorly to identify the challenges in 1 to 3 words. No more sentences. They're bold, they're big, and it's pain. And then on top of that, it's his job to eloquently tell the story of how his product solves pain 1, pain 2, and pain 3. and then ask the stakeholder for feedback. That was something, and it's tiny little tweaks like that like we've seen make a huge difference in the efficacy and the, you know, how well a call goes. Yeah, anything to add, Brian?
Uh, no, not really. I think that you covered it super well.
So, I'm interested to know, how do you course correct it? So you have a slide deck prepared, right? Where you may have you have the slide with the pain points. So here's what we see. Customers are struggling with this, struggling with this, struggling with this. What have you ever had the situation where before you get to the slides in the discovery portion, they don't have any of those pain points, or they may only have one out of the three, and then you get to that slide, and obviously the slide isn't as relevant and
I
the
think it's
story.
I think it's totally contingent on who you're selling to, what you're selling, who your buyers are. But in Brian's case, like I said, like all the slides are applicable to all prospects generally.
Yeah. And I think that it's a question of how well do you understand your customer, because if your ICP is narrow enough and the pain is well defined enough, then you really shouldn't have any of those situations unless it's honestly a true DQ where you're just like, hey, this is actually not a good fit for our services. That's the only case where that should be happening. Otherwise, I would argue that in this case, someone like maybe there isn't as clear of an understanding of this is the pain if this is someone who we're selling to. And in our case, like we might have like 3 or 4 different themes of pain, and I only find myself using 2 of them all the time, which tells me that, like, yes, we're actually sniffing in the right area. We're solving real pain. It's consistent pain. And that as a founder, like just stepping out of my sales hat, like as a founder, like I'm very glad that systematically we are able to target these folks consistently time over time. And that's the formation of just a repeatable motion that we're all after.
Love it. Okay.
And strong product market fit.
Yeah. And so talk to me a little bit about the discovery part of the call, right? What's your approach there? So I'm assuming you have kind of your list of questions built out beforehand. How many questions are there in a 30-minute call? How long does the discovery take? And then my final question, and this is something that that I could use help with, is, and I'm sure you're in the same situation, Brian, as being a startup founder, you're probably in that boat where you're doing 5, 6 calls a day, maybe more, with these prospects, and the prospects are qualified, but maybe this is the first time you're talking to these prospects. How much of that discovery do you tailor to each one? I mean, how much can you really tailor if you're doing 5, 6, 7 calls a day or more, right? So talk to me a little bit about that, your approach there with discovery.
Yeah. Oh, so let's take a 30-minute call, right? And let's just dissect the anatomy of a call. And maybe you're starting consistently at minute 1 or minute 2, where just pending someone coming on in time. And then really where you start is a strong agenda. And Morgan talked about this at the very beginning, but you start with a strong agenda, and you need to call out like, hey, look, this is a 30-minute call. I have a hard stop. Oftentimes they do too. And the way that Morgan articulates this to me is that you need to communicate that part, because it shows that you value your time, you value their time. And then from there, you map out like, here's how this goes. I'm going to ask and learn a little bit more about your business. I would love to talk a little bit more about Revenue Vessel. And from there, I want to show you a demo of the platform itself. And this is specific to us, and different people have different processes that could really work just depending on your buying cycle. But that is how we choose to run it. And then, so that'll take like a minute, often less than a minute. They'll say, yes, sounds great. And then they'll start talking about their business. So maybe for the next 15 minutes, right? And generally by like the 15-minute mark, I want to start to transition, and this is enough. And what we figured out is it's not really the questions that you ask, but it's really like the bits of information that really matter is, number 1, there is a key blocker that is stopping them from doing more sales in our case. So we need to get to that question as concisely and easily as possible. And the other thing that really matters is understanding what they want to be doing. And it's like, if you hear those 2 things, then everything else generally falls into place. So really, like the questions that are the baseline level of questions that we'll ask are like, number one, what are your blockers today? What are you looking to do in 2025 or 2026, whatever it is? What are you looking to do? And they'll answer that and talk about their blockers. And
I
then it
want to I want to
becomes,
interrupt. I want to interrupt that Brian is brilliant, and because he has so much content and experience knowledge in kind of surrounding the product in which he is selling, it's incredibly easy for him to deduct and deduce from what prospects are sharing with him, and it immediately triggers in his head as ooh pain point, ooh pain point.
Right.
I also have a similar background as Brian, and I do not deduce as easily as he does. I have pushed and much prefer a list of discovery questions that are tried and true. Brian is brilliant and doesn't need it. He can tell me the pain point when we go back through the call. I'm like, I don't know what the pain is. He's like, I know what the pain is. And so I just want to say, like, as a caveat here, like I don't know if this is necessarily best practice for all founders. Some people are. I'm clearly very process oriented. Brian is able to kind of create this beautiful story and amoeba kind of a little bit more loosely based on what prospects share with him. But he is correct. Luckily, based on the product in which Revenue Vessel is selling, it is really boils down to those two areas in which he said. I do think for a newer sales rep joining the team, it's going to be important to fine tune a list of tried and true discovery questions that help elicit those two main buckets that he discussed.
yeah. And I think so. I mean, just to pause on the first 15 minutes, right? And we should get to the latter 15, but just to pause on that and talk more about it. What I find myself doing the most coaching on is around like these subtle indicators. So we do go in with like a couple of key questions to ask and to kick off and get started. There's always like key and subtle indicators on what this is. And oftentimes, like what our sales coaching really boils down to is I'll take a look at this one key moment and I'll be like, hey, did you catch that this is what they were saying? And did you catch that this is like really the underlying challenges that they're doing and how that's going to set you up? And then that's like really where we start to focus on. And I think that's let's dissect this moment and get into the head of your of the prospect over here. And that's when we'll start to dive in, right? And it's like from those key moments you were asking Anmol, like, hey, I don't have a lot of time. Like, how do I understand the customer and get them to trust me? And I think that that's like really what we need to accomplish in the first 15 minutes. So like there are like, and I would say that that's like probably where I do well is just understanding and highlighting the individual pain, just because this is the world that I come from.
Yeah.
And I understand them as people. I've been them, I've done them, right? Like I've done this work with them, right? So I get it. That's like the first 15 minutes. And then like from there, it's then from there, it's like, okay, now for the next 5 minutes, you need to talk through how like Revenue Vessel fits into this. Because by this point, like, sure, they're happy to spend 15 minutes with you because they committed to it and it's like promising. But then this next 5 minutes is really where the trust builds in, where they're like, oh, he understands me, he gets it. And really at the end of the day, it boils down to like, understanding who they are. So like some people might come to me and say, look, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to build brand awareness of what I'm doing. And that's a very different type of story for versus someone who's like, I need to go and build pipeline in these territories. I travel all the time and I go to these territories and I don't know who's there. And you need to communicate to them differently, right? So the next couple minutes is really where we start to break out the slides and
Connect the
really like
dots.
we start to orient the slides around that pain. So if they're telling, like, let's take the example of someone who wants to build brand awareness on LinkedIn or email marketing on who they are. That's where we'll take the slides and we'll say, hey, this is your pain. This is our understanding of why this pain exists. Here is the underlying breakdown. And there are certain discovery motions where you actually ask about that. We don't do that anymore because this is just a much more concise way to get there and get them to say yes, where generally we're right. And they'll often add in like, oh yeah, and totally, this is absolutely what it is. and also like XYZ. And this gives you way more information on everything else. And they might talk about someone else on the team, or they might talk about how they collaborate with others, or someone might say, oh yeah, totally, like, right. They'll start to give you more information, and that continues on the discovery. And the key thing is that you pause and really talk through and let that story sink in. Is this correct? And then from there, if they say that it's correct, then we talk about revenue vessel as it relates to that pain. So then it's like, okay, cool. Well, now it turns out that you want to build this brand strategy. This is how revenue can support you in doing that. The way that we think about it is right, and blah, blah, blah. And then we start to talk about that pain individually and how revenue is designed to solve it. And that dovetails super nicely into a demo right after, where it's like, okay, now let me show you in
Yeah.
like 5 clicks how you can go and do that. And that's when the mind
Aha
gets
moment.
blown.
Yeah.
Right. So the anatomy is like, to summarize it, 15 minutes to understand pain and understand how you're going to position revenue vessel. The next 5 minutes is articulating why the pain exists, and that builds trust. Then it's talking through, here is what revenue vessel is, to get them intrigued. And then the light bulb moment is the demo, where they're like, oh yes, this totally will help us. And generally what I find is that a lot of the objections that we'll get, so to speak, are just fake. Because once we go through this process in the right way, no one says like, hey, pricing is the main way that we'll make
Mhm.
this determination. People will communicate upfront that they're price sensitive. But if I hear like, oh, does it do this? Does it do that? Does it do this? Does it do that? Um, Generally, I find that I just haven't communicated value the right way.
Right.
And Morgan is very good at just pointing out like, hey, look, they're not sold. And as a sales rep, the hardest thing to do, because especially when you don't have a lot of deals, is to just face the fact that you didn't do good on the sales call.
So what happens after the demo and that aha moment? Let's say you run through the sales, that discovery call, you get that aha moment, then what happens that last few minutes of the call? Like, how do you close? Are you going into pricing? Then what's the call to action? Are you positioning a pilot or a POC, or talk to us a little bit about how you close that discovery call?
I can talk about the next steps here and how we think about it, but I do want Morgan to talk about the coaching that she's given us on designing the next steps. But ultimately from there, it's like, that's the end of 30 minutes, right? Like that's 30 minutes. And then from there, like we'll just schedule a follow-up call. Depending on how they want to do it, I'll just open it up the calendar. And it's always important to just hold your ground there. If they sometimes they'll say, hey, look, I'm busy. Super important to just say, okay, look, well, why don't we schedule something tentative? I have my calendar open. What about this day? And oftentimes people will be open to doing it. Right. But generally, like the next step will be pricing. And then from there, we have a bunch of other next steps. And then sometimes, like, I'll just make up next steps on the fly, especially
Right.
with more enterprise customers who have more custom needs. They'll say, like, oh, we need to do like XYZ legal process and XYZ procurement. And then it'll be like, okay, well, cool. Here's some documentation that might be helpful.
Hmm.
Why don't we go over it on a call like next week? And then they'll be like, oh yeah, totally, this makes a lot of sense, right? And but that wasn't a native thing that I was good at out of the womb. And this is like from Morgan. And Morgan, I would love for you to talk about like how you coached us through that.
For sure. Yeah. So a lot of this is processes. So I think it's incredibly important to stop sharing your screen with 3 to 5 minutes left on the call, to ask for feedback. So based on what we discussed and you saw today, interested to hear your feedback. Does this solve XYZ company's problems? Do you see value? Does it make sense to continue on at the evaluation? Because again, I'm not in the business of wasting anyone's time, and I also don't want my time wasted. Typically, that's also really helpful to better understand, what stood out to them, what you could have done better. And then it's setting up clear next steps with value. So typically what happens from here is clients do a pricing review call with me. We'll walk through a custom proposal live on the call. You can ask questions. And then from there, we would go into, a blah, blah, blah. It's prescribing next steps. I think Brian and the team are really good at not getting off that call
Until there's
with that.
next steps identified. Yeah. Got it.
Exactly. And then a big thing again is I reiterated actually on one of our recent sessions is having a bucket of potential suggestions for next steps. It's the seller's job to guide the sales process. They've never bought your product before. They don't know what is best when buying your product. It's your job to kind of guide them, of course, understanding what their decision process looks like internally as well, but incredibly important for startups as you become, and luckily Brian's able to be kind of nimble and work on the fly that way, but that is a recommendation that I've made.
Yeah, and it's like your confidence when delivering these next steps really matters, because it's the difference between saying this is just the next step in our process. If you really like us, give them the out to just say no, we're not interested. If you're interested, like here's the next step, and being very deliberate about that, and even being able to communicate why that's so important.
Yeah. And then from a process perspective, you guys are selling to big enterprise organizations. You've had a ton of success, but you're an early stage startup, right? We're going through the milestones. What are the types of like security requirements that come up in the process as you're selling to these big companies? And is that a blocker, right? Talk to me. How long does that take usually?
It's the most
Tell me a
sexy
little bit
part.
about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is security the biggest question mark, or is it more legal? Like, talk to me a little bit about some of those like tactical, specific procurement next steps.
I mean, legal is always going to be a blocker, especially at the enterprise stage. And oftentimes, like legal for them is just going to be really backed up. And honestly, the only thing that you can do is just hope that your sales process was really good at the beginning so that your stakeholder really wants to push for you. There might be additional techniques that Morgan has, but what I find is that by call number 2, like once you've had 2 calls, like the sales motion is pretty much done for us. Like you're just done. It's hard to communicate additional value outside of new product that gets introduced that they find really compelling. But just to go back to the legal question, procurement, security are all challenges. For us, like we find that legal is the main roadblock. I think legal is the roadblock for everyone. We do answer compliance and security questionnaires. At this stage of our company, we don't really ingest any customer data. So it's generally they're reading our information and then they're using it in their own processes, but their data doesn't touch our system. So that's really what has helped shortcut a lot of these other requirements. And so we've been able to get around some of those. And the idea for sure, and we've talked about this with a lot of our customers, is we absolutely do want to get into that. This is just the right way to get started with us. And then once we are an established vendor in their system, then we're much more comfortable saying, okay, look, like we're done with legal, so we don't have to worry about that. Let's just worry about procurement. Let's just worry about an additional security leg, right? With when that new product comes in, and to just make sure that we're compliant and using that internally.
What about like pilots or proof of concepts? Do you feel like that's a requirement for your customers? If it is, how do you time box those? Because we know those can kind of go off the rails and driving engagement on those. How do you run those? Are you trying to like get away from pilots somehow? Like, talk to me a little bit about that.
Does anyone like proof of concepts?
I think that we've really like narrowed it down, right? And I think what we used to do, like very early in our history, it used to be like a 3-month set of
Right.
It used to be like a 3-month trial where they could opt. It wasn't even an opt out. It was like 3 months they're in, and then they need to sign another contract. So it was like we were playing the game on hard mode at that point. And like early on, Morgan had given us a lot of coaching on how do you handle these trial conversations. And I vividly remember like one customer that we really tried to win, who has now come back. But like we were really trying to win them at the time, and I was trying to use some of this feedback on how to talk through a trial. It didn't work because honestly, the sales process wasn't very good. And I think that like eventually now trials do work and they are good and they're time bound to like a week. And the way that we're able to do that is we're able to say like, look, here's the value that you want to see. There's either 2 things that people want to validate for us. Like number 1 is that they want to validate the data quality. And the other thing that they want to do is they want to validate that the workflows that we said are actually true and valid and do work, right? So what we do is like now we talk to those 2 points, and the requirement for a trial is that they need to be able to articulate, I want one of these 2 things. And here's where trials don't work. They're when we don't communicate the value well, and they're like, okay, well, we have this existing provider and we want to run a trial and compare you side by side.
Right.
That doesn't work.
That doesn't
And
work.
in fact, I'd rather just DQ that.
Yeah.
And then come back to them when they do have a pain. And that's something that like Morgan has helped us see, like, look, this, they don't have pain, like don't talk to them. But then the conversations around how to run a trial and communicate those, look, this is typically how people validate it, right? Having all of that language is what we refined over time.
Mm-hmm. And then, so you're time bounding the trial to the 1 week. I'm assuming you're engaging in the trial with that one key stakeholder. Like you're not trying to like onboard a full team and driving consumption and engagement and things like that. And the other thing I heard from you is those very specific success criteria, very discrete success criteria that's easy to hit and then easy to measure, like yes or no within that week time frame.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then another question for you, Morgan. So Morgan, I'm seeing 2 themes in this conversation so far. Theme number 1 is Brian is brilliant. And since you're his coach, then I'm assuming how brilliant you must be if you're his coach. But then also the importance of coaching itself, because even somebody like Brian, who's as good as he is, needs a coach, needs that outside perspective to try to get better, right? So given that, like there's a lot of things that Brian is doing well. Obviously, he's performing at an elite level, but he wasn't necessarily a born salesperson. He's a founder that has become very, very good at sales. But what are some things when you first started working with him on those sales calls? What are some things that were blind spots or blinders for him? Something that he wasn't doing well that you had to show him, or maybe something that he was doing that he wasn't aware of that needed to be tweaked? Maybe like a blind spot that you can talk to us about. That's also common with other founders or other people that you're coaching.
That's an easy question for founders specifically. Founders, their product is their baby.
Yeah.
And they can talk up and down and sideways about their baby and their product and how it solves world hunger and all of that. Prospects in a buying process don't care about your, war stories. How does the product specifically help them? And so that's been a lot of like tailoring over time, which now Brian is great at. But at first it was telling the story, and a little too much story, in my opinion, about the product and the evolution of the product. If a prospect asks, of course, open up and share. But typically people care most about how the product specifically helps with their very finite problem. And founders, I think, would get the most benefit from fine-tuning that talk track, which is a learned skill. It's not easy to hear the various pain points that happen on your 6 to 7 calls a day on back-to-back meetings, and be able to fine-tune how your product can be the perfect solution for their specific needs. And process. Just like, like if you didn't have sales training, you wouldn't know how to run a good call. And a good call to a founder is just like a really good conversation, where like for me, I was listening to these calls being like, there's no agenda, what's happening? So process, and that like very learned skill of a very specific talk track based on the pain points of the stakeholders you speak to.
And then Brian, now that you guys have this this process, this blueprint that works, that Morgan has helped you build, and you beta tested it on numerous calls, this works. Right now you're at the next step of your journey. You're getting ready for that next seed round. You're growing, you're getting revenue, you're hiring a team, right? You've got SDRs on your team. How are you coaching them to do what you do? Like, how are you teaching them to be like another Brian?
I don't want them to be another Brian, right? Like people buy differently from each, but just in terms of the technique though, and teaching that, the way that we think about it is like there's with SDRs and AEs, it's different. So when we're thinking about training AEs, it's really about their understanding of identifying pain. And that's something that we've talked about a lot over the course of this call. And it's more like what I'm realizing is that a lot of these things that we've honed over time that you just say a lot, it really is a skill that your brain knows to just say,
Mhm.
okay, this if X, then Y, right? And it's actually more, and it's not like it's formulaic, like there's a sheet that I can go into in like a
Mhm.
computer program. It's more just like, okay, I've heard this. This is the right thing. This is what this means. And I've just become better at decoding what that means. And that's the real skill that I think Morgan is talking about. And really, it's now training that, okay, here's how you refine that motion in our rep. And the materials that we can prepare are things like, here are the brass tacks of what we're doing. This is what the slide deck means. Here is the pain that we're solving. Here are our different customers and how they all think about the world. Here's like other things that we can talk about that. But really, it goes down to each individual call, actually making the time, because it's so easy to not spend the time to do this, but making the time to just point out each individual line and highlight, here's what you missed. And that's where we're seeing like the real improvements in
Mhm.
performance over time. It's just that. And with SDRs, it's the same way. Although with SDRs, it's a little bit more straightforward, where it's like you only really have 4 lines to make an impression and start a conversation. It arguably even less, like arguably you have two. And so like really it boils down to number one, are you doing this line right? And are you getting the next call? And if you hire SDRs right, like luckily there's like some type of charisma that they have over the
Yeah.
phone, and that's super hard to teach. So ideally they're getting through that. And then the next thing is, how are they delivering revenue vessel, and how are they understanding, how are they leading and using like a context-based opener or something like that, where one of our new reps now is very good at saying, oh, hey, or Chris is very good at saying like, hey, I saw that this is what you were doing. Um, this is how revenue vessel is interesting to you. Is that worth a conversation? And they might say other things, right? And then it really boils down to those two things. And then from there, there's also a couple of objections where it's like, can you talk to the fact that someone is going to say that they work with our competitors already?
Mhm. Mhm.
And then can you talk and paint that picture in a good way that gets them compelled? And even today, like we have new reps, right? And there were like maybe 4 or 5 calls where they were blocked by an objection. And it's like the best SDRs in the world would have been able to turn like 3 of those into warm meetings. Right. And then like, less and you need to get to that point, and you need to learn to that point. So that's how I think about it. And I do know that like there were 1 or 2 ops that were left on the table here. And I'm
Mhm.
okay with that, especially for a learning experience.
Yeah. All right. Should we move to the rapid fire question section of the podcast? All right. So I've got 3 questions here. So why don't we do this? Why don't we start with you, Morgan? I'll ask you the question, then Brian, then I'll ask the next question. And that's how we'll do the rapid fire. So, Morgan, for you, we talked a little bit about this in the conversation already. But when you're on a call or analyzing one of Brian's calls, what's one subtle sign, like unstated sign, that you can see on a sales call that tells you it's really going well?
Ooh, that's a great question. Um, if the for revenue vessels specifically, if they are not asking BS questions at the end of the demo, I know that the call went well. And when I say BS, Brian mentioned this earlier on today's call. If they're asking questions that prove they don't see the value, so if they're asking silly questions about data origin or things like that, I can tell that maybe the value wasn't delivered effectively. That's very specific to revenue vessel, but that's a universal theme I've seen over the past couple of weeks from reviewing their calls.
Or another thing I would say is maybe like no questions. You guys have any questions? No, we're good. We got what we need. Call probably didn't go that well.
Yeah.
Okay, Brian,
Uh,
over.
Yeah. For me,
Brian,
it's
over to
vigorous nodding.
you.
Yeah,
Vigorous
because
nodding with
people
smiling
do
or no
get pumped.
smiling?
People do get pumped up about this.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you can tell, especially when I'm presenting the slides, and you can tell that I listened well. I was able to position exactly their language into the reasons why,
Mhm.
and being able to tell them in a very articulate way that gets them to just say, "Oh yeah, totally." Like you'll see
Mhm.
like almost full body. And when I do that, then that's how I know
Vigorous
that
head
everything.
nodding.
Yeah, totally. And that this is something that in the call recordings Morgan can't see
Yeah.
because I'm speaking, right? And therefore like the call
Oh,
recording
that's
had,
fair. That's
yeah,
fair.
it doesn't have,
Yeah.
yeah.
All
There's so
right.
many calls that I wanted to send you, Morgan, where I'm like, I'm so proud of myself, but then you
Yeah.
couldn't see the head nodding, and I was like, oh, this doesn't hit the same way.
All right. Question number 2, Morgan, for you from a prospecting perspective, cold call or cold email? Or if you had to pick one, which
Have
one would you
to,
pick?
because I'm multi-thread till the day that I
Yeah.
die. LinkedIn, cold call, email, and if you're not doing all three, you're not being effective. I think stats say cold calls are most effective, but I love a warm LinkedIn win, man.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And then I'm pretty sure I know what Brian is going to say, but Brian, cold call or cold email?
Call.
Call. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds
I
so. It
mean,
looks like
Morgan's
cold
right,
calling still
but
works,
call.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Last rapid fire question, Morgan, to you. We're big readers over here in Self-Actualize, and we're building a company trying to help people improve. So, what's your favorite podcast, book, or tool for improving sales and sales skills?
Oh man. I was just on a podcast yesterday with Sell Better, so it's you know, like object relevance because it's so close. I dabble and do research in tons of sales methodologies and podcasts. I'm a huge LinkedIn browser, and I think a ton of people are brilliant sharing sales strategies there as well. But Sell Better is a phenomenal podcast, and they have tons of great resources as well.
Do you have a favorite sales book or an author?
I don't. I actually choose typically to read non-sales related stuff. My whole life is sales. I
Yeah.
have a
Yeah.
full-time job in sales. I
Yeah.
consult in sales. A lot of my coaching comes from actual experience, and
Yeah.
that's what I see as most valuable. So unfortunately, I don't have. Brian, do you have a sales author that is your favorite?
I was about to be cheeky and say hire Morgan Shelly. But the honest truth though is that like I really do think that coaching you don't I'm sure that a lot of people have said, hey, read Challenger Sale or read like some of these other
Yeah.
books.
Right.
But I think at the crux of it is like I didn't really see improvement until we were able to like go into the individual line and say, hey, this is an opportunity you missed. And especially when you only have 30 minutes in a call that do matter, it's like those micro moments are the key. And if you're
Yeah.
not converting on like in minute 2 or 3 or minute 2 to minute 5 or whatever it is, and you miss out on something, the
Mhm.
rest of the call just falls flat.
Yeah.
So I really do think that a coach highlighting like, hey, this is really where you had the opportunity to highlight it. Whereas like I read LinkedIn stuff all the time. And the way that I use it is like Danny and Noah like send over stuff on my co-founders send over stuff from LinkedIn all the time and are like, oh, this is interesting. And to me, like the way that I assess it is it's not like I have to follow that to the letter of the law. But if we do assess and try to answer questions on does our sales process meet that bar, it's a good way to understand whether or not you're meeting the bar of what they're saying, right? Where someone will post like, oh, it's super important to have multi-threading or it's super important to have exec buy-in, blah, 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 right? It doesn't tell you how to do that or how to get there. But we need to make sure that our sales process that we have today meets that bar.
Yeah. So it looks like it was really coaching that kind of took you to the next level, the real-time feedback to help you perform in that moment, right? Above and beyond any book or podcast or any of that like afterwards or static content.
Absolutely. And Self-Actualize paid me $0 to say that. I'll just say that up front. Like I truly believe that the game was really ratcheted up once we brought Morgan on, and she's really helped us scale to other sellers as well.
Yeah. We definitely love coaching over here at
I'm
SelfActualize.
a huge advocate of coaching. It changed my life as well.
Yeah, same here. Well, Morgan and Brian, it's been an absolute pleasure. We had a lot of fun on part 1 with Brian, and this has just been incredible. So really awesome having you guys here on the podcast, especially you, Morgan. It's East Coast time and you're on vacation. And then Brian, you've got a big milestone coming up with your company. So congratulations on that. But I know you guys are super, super busy, and I really appreciate you guys being here today.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, great. All right, guys. So for more insights on coaching, on founder-led sales, and building scalable go-to-market engines, check out selfactualize.ai. Again, huge thanks to Brian and Morgan for joining us today. If you want to connect with them or learn more about Revenue Vessel, we'll drop the links in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the SelfActualize podcast. Goodbye.